You know what the largest, biggest oxymoron is in our world today? It's the term controlled substances. Because as soon as you prohibit something, you give up all of your controls to the bad guys. And
there's a cardinal rule of prohibition. Always push the stronger stuff. Why? Because it's more money. And if I am an alcohol prohibition and I'm going to run into the same criminal justice sanctions for pushing a barrel of beer as a barrel of bourbon, guess which one I'm going to push? So it's obviously bourbon, it's stronger, I make more money. It's the same issue with regard to marijuana. They don't distinguish between selling strong marijuana or less strong marijuana. It's the same sanction, so you always push the stronger stuff. It's hard to find more mild marijuana in the market today because of drug prohibition. So the answer is yes, it's stronger because that's the cardinal rule of prohibition.
Freedoms and our liberties. That's what makes us special. In fact, our soul of our country is our freedoms and liberties. And today I really believe, and I expect that you agree with me, that our soul, our very soul, is under attack by our very own government. 1992, I did something really unusual for a sitting trial court judge here. I did something unusual. I held a press conference, April the 8th, 1992, and stated my avowed conviction that drug prohibition was not working and we had to do something, put our heads together to change it. That was an understatement, because now when I speak with Rotary clubs, religious groups, political, whatever, I come out with my first comment, which is drug prohibition is the biggest failed policy in the history of the United States of America, second only to slavery. And it's true. I have seen in my own courtroom us churning low-level drug offenders through the system for no good purpose, in many ways ruining their lives, and came to the conclusion that yes, these drugs can be harmful, although drug prohibition was inflicting more harms really than the drugs were. And if you wanted to reduce the harms from the drugs, repeal drug prohibition. I've been involved with talking about drug policy reform now since 1992 actively. And what we really need to do is just to legalize the conversation. Because today the government just does not want this to be discussed at all. Ask yourself the question, why is the federal government so apoplectic about medical marijuana? I mean, come on, we have elderly people that have never even gotten a jaywalking ticket that are now being prosecuted for medical marijuana, and it is fundamentally clear that medical marijuana is a viable medicine. We're going to have an initiative on the ballot here in California in 2016. It will be to regulate and control marijuana like wine or whatever it is that we end up calling it. If we do our job anywhere near right, it's going to pass. And it will be a revolution. Colorado was the revolution in 2012 along with the state of Washington. Now we have Alaska and Oregon, as well as the District of Columbia. California, if we join that, the federal government just will not be able to internalize that problem.
Almost all Americans now seem to assume that the government has to tell you what kind of drugs you can take or not. This is actually a development of modern origins of the last century or so. In my grandparents' lifetime, however, it was perfectly possible to walk into any pharmacy in the United States and buy any drug. You could buy opium, cocaine, heroin when that came out, cannabis, or whatever. Didn't even need a doctor's prescription for it. It's just available over the counter. Now, this was back at the turn of the last century. And this was not a time when America was crippled by drug addiction, leading the world into the new into the new consumer industrial revolution. We were a vital country then, and there was no problem with people being able to just freely go into the drugstore and take drugs. And in fact, if you look at the historical statistics they've got on this, the drug addiction rate at that time was less than 0.5% or so of the population, which is, if anything, a little lower than the percentage that we now have in the population with this multi-billion-dollar federal anti-drug budget. And war on drugs was really a conspiracy of big government bureaucrats. And it really started with the first progressive era 100 years ago, which was also a time when forward-thinking people thought that the government should be more active in cleaning up people's lives. 100 years ago, it was decided that there should be these pharmacy boards to start looking at what people can do. And there was also, of course, an alcohol prohibition movement coming on, which sort of added extra steam to this whole movement. And in 1914, the United States enacted the Harrison Act, which is really the first big federal anti-narcotics law. It's interesting that that law was passed by a constitutional subterfuge. They did do alcohol prohibition. They had to make it a constitutional amendment because everybody knew that the government couldn't tell people, that they can't use alcohol. That was not a constitutional power.
I have been doing for the past 5 years is I've been working in the state capitol to try and pass a system of rules and state licenses. As much as I didn't like the industry at the time, I didn't like the fact that cancer patients were having to pay $300 for an ounce. I didn't like that. That industry frustrated me. I went to that industry and said, we have to work. We have to work as a team. And there was literally an empty parking space at the state capitol for a group, for a trade group that just represented this industry. So 2.5 years ago, after I organized the Utah County Growers Association and helped them pass their first ordinance, I formed the California Cannabis Industry Association. That was about 2.5 years ago. We're now this year we were able to finally get a bill passed. What we saw was, we just kind of give you a breakdown of what actually happened. We went from one paragraph of rules and regulations to 88 pages. we in Charter California form. we're not necessarily excited about those 88 pages of rules, but it's going to be better than having our doors smashed in. We will create a wet and dry counties. There's a full local control. So if your local government doesn't want to allow dispensaries, or you're not ready, you want to see what happens, it's not going to be forced on you. The local governments will have an actual option. It's going to have there will be a complete seed to sale tracking. So law enforcement, if they stop somebody on the side of the road at 4 in the morning, and they have 10 pounds of pot in the back of the car, and they say it's going to a legal dispensary, well, they better have the actual paperwork there to say it is, and that so that way they can know who the unregulated growers are, who the underground growers are, and who the actual state compliant growers are. We also saw some very interesting stuff this year. Labor got involved. They wanted to make it easier to organize. I think, no one's shocked. I think the biggest shocker, though, because I think a lot of us, when you're in college or back in the day, I'm not saying what you were doing in those college dorm rooms, but you have discussions. Everyone theorizes why weed's not legal yet, and you hear big alcohol. Big alcohol's, actually trying to keep it down. I watched it happen this year. I watched the largest alcohol distribution firms in the state hire some of the biggest lobbying firms to try and restrict our bills. Within 1 month of the bill, about a month, say end of July, these groups popped up out of nowhere and wanted to completely rewrite the entire bill, mandate it so the alcohol distribution companies would have full control of the entire product. I'm like, this isn't college, this is real life. They were actually trying to make it happen. We were able to use the data that because they've been controlling the alcohol market for the last 100 years or so, we were able to show that when you mandate distribution, you will let or you mandate that farmers have to sell their product to a distribution firm. They get to control the price for the entire state. So you end up having 4 companies which can set the price for the entire state. Therefore, they can raise it or lower it as they like. And for our members, that was a huge deal. So one of the big things we were happy to get was an amendment that clarified that even though there was distribution somewhat involved, farmers still could go directly to dispensaries once their product was processed and packaged.
For me, it goes back to an interview that Reason had with Ronald Reagan in 1975. And he said he thought the very heart and soul of conservatism was libertarianism, these ideas of individual liberty and limited government. And that's exactly why I think drug legalization is a great Republican issue. In the name of fighting the drug war, which has been quite unsuccessful, it's estimated that we have spent about $1 trillion with no effect. You heard discussion of the dollars being diverted, but if we care about limited government, could that $1 trillion have been used more effectively? So what we're doing, again, from a libertarian, from a Republican or limited government perspective, is we're taking resources and instead of using them for social services or for fixing the roads or improving traffic congestion, we're directing those resources to locking up people who are not hurting anyone else by ingesting a substance. And my concern from a Republican perspective is that this could get worse, and we'll start now locking up people who drink big gulps. Or when the big gulps are illegal, who buy 2 sodas and drink the same as a big gulp. At what point do we stop and say responsibility for taking care of yourself and your health is up to you? It is not the government's job. It's not our job to be our brother's keeper. There's a corrupting effect from having too many laws, for having laws that don't make any sense. So I grew up with the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. And when I learned to drive on the freeways, always looking in the rearview mirror, checking, am I going to get a ticket? And I remember distinctly when the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit changed and it went up to 70, and I was going with the flow of traffic and I was checking the rearview mirror, and then I looked at the sign, and suddenly I wasn't a criminal anymore. The 55-mile-an-hour speed limit didn't make sense on rural highways where I grew up. It was imposed by Jimmy Carter to try to control energy consumption. It didn't have anything to do with safety or what the roads would bear. Now think about our children, who, if they experiment with marijuana, 21-year-old experimenting with marijuana, they are disobeying the law. We are creating a category of people who are lawbreakers. Instead of people, medical marijuana patients, they're still federal felons. They're still breaking the law. And so what happens inside your brain when the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit changes, or when we legalize marijuana, and these people are no longer seeing themselves as criminals? The dirty secret of the drug war is that the effect is disproportionately on minority communities. 50% of black males in their 20s are in the criminal justice system. And when you felonize drug use, you are making someone unemployable. And when those drug laws are not applied equally, because drug use is the same across all ethnic groups, but the drug laws are not applied equally across all ethnic groups. I think this is an opportunity for Republicans to be on the leading edge of the cause of social justice. Of let's not felonize people and make them unemployable. If there is a problem with drug abuse, let's focus on the treatment and work on building strong economy. And if you take marijuana from being illegal to legal, you really undercut the entire justification for this $1 trillion drug war. The difference between secure property rights, labeled products, tested products, purveyors who have liability if what they've sold is not up to snuff, versus an entire black market, where you don't know what you're getting, where things are out of control, and in fact creates a criminal element that would go away if the distribution of these drugs were controlled and regulated. But one of the consequences of America's drug prohibition is that it has undermined the rule of law in Latin America. Governments in many Latin American countries are not able to keep control because the illicit market is so strong, the demand from Americans is so strong. And it's estimated that there are some 60,000 Mexicans are victims have been killed as a result of this war on drugs over the last 10 years. Since I care about the rule of law, I would like to have our laws line up with a respect for human nature and not export the undermining of the rule of law to Mexico and resulting in these 60,000 deaths. It is taxation without representation to have the asset forfeiture approach that we have right now. So, and that's been done in the name of fighting drugs. So that's yet another way that we can have a better approach to the rule of law. There's this discussion about whether marijuana is a gateway drug, and I must say, marijuana was a gateway drug for me to alcohol and tobacco. I tried them subsequently, and they are not good drugs for me. Tobacco makes me irritable. Alcohol, I'm a little bit too much, and it's not a good situation. There's an opportunity here for us to be more honest with our children, with our communities. And this is the culture that we need to foster. Not to tell our children never do these things or you will go to hell, but to understand that their actions have consequences and that they need to live responsible lives and to get good information and to be responsible citizens of this great country. Thank you for your...
You had Rand Paul, first of all, get up and say that he thought the war on drugs has a racial outcome and has damaged our inner cities. You had Jeb Bush actually admit to smoking marijuana when he was younger, and even though he talked about what he saw as a drug problem in this country, he did say that he supported medical marijuana. You had Chris Christie chime in and touting the fact that New Jersey was the first state in the nation that mandates treatment rather than jail time for, as he put it, first offenses by non-violent, non-dealing drug users. And he also expressed his preference for rehabilitation over jail time, and even said that the war on drugs was a failure in his opinion. And then Carly Fiorina, California's own, was calling for criminal justice reform, and she talked about how the United States has the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, and 2/3 of the people in our prisons being in jail because of mostly nonviolent drug offenses. And she also said that she thought the current system is not working. And so this is pretty striking, I think, compared to what we would have experienced, many years ago. None of these people, with maybe the exception of Rand Paul, would be in favor of full-fledged legalization. But the needle, I think, has moved pretty dramatically on this issue. Back in 1990, 73% of all Americans, so just about 3/4, favored mandatory use of the death penalty for drug traffickers. And 57% said that police should be allowed to search the houses of known drug dealers without a court order. And so, here we have, just a couple of decades later, you have multiple presidential candidates pretty much universally admitting the failure of the war on drugs and advocating treatment before incarceration. I think that the reason why the needle has moved is because of an issue that wasn't talked about at all in that debate. And so, if you think about that debate for a second, you've got candidates debating about the morality of smoking marijuana or taking drugs more generally. You had a discussion, albeit a relatively non-medical one, about whether marijuana is a gateway drug or whether it's more dangerous relative to drugs like alcohol that are legal. You had talk about whether or not pot today is more potent than it was years ago. And Rand Paul and others sort of got into a debate about the 10th Amendment and federalism and the role of states' rights in discussing the legalization issue. And these are all important questions, are all very important aspects of the debate. But the aspect that wasn't talked about, not a single candidate vocalized a single word about whether or not the war on drugs is worth the financial cost. Fiscal conservatives, and as you typically think of Republicans as sort of talking about fiscal issues first, or not first, and certainly one of the initial things that comes to mind when assessing any sort of policy, asking the question, where does the money come from for all of these policies that we enact, not just in Washington, but at the state level too? But I would argue very strongly that I think there's really no Republican or no fiscal conservative can ignore the costs of the war on drugs and marijuana prohibition. And so what are those costs? Well, as David mentioned, the best estimate we have is that since the imposition of the war on drugs in 1971, we've spent about $1 trillion. And whether we've gotten any benefits in return is, of course, pretty unlikely. Total spending today is estimated to be about $40 billion a year. That's from Gary Becker, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, a couple years ago, writing in the Wall Street Journal. Although there have been plenty of other estimates that have said that rate is probably much higher than that, maybe as much as $51 billion a year. If you sort of put those numbers in perspective for a little bit, the entire Department of Energy budget is about $25 to $30 billion. And the Department of Education is about 60 to 70 billion. So the war on drugs per year is basically costing us somewhere in between what we spend on those two. Our costs, of course, don't even tell the full story. So, Becker's op-ed went on to point out that as he said, there are many other harmful effects of the war on drugs that are difficult to quantify. And so we've touched on a couple of those today, but I'll mention a couple others. One is we talk about high school dropout rates, which are roughly 25% nationally, and those rates are obviously much higher among poor minority students in inner cities. And there are many reasons why that exists, but I think it's pretty obvious that one of those also has to do with consequences of the drug war. It's oftentimes more profitable for disadvantaged youth in the inner cities to drop out of school and try to profit from the drug trade. The irony, I think, about the drug war and sort of the continued push to prohibit drugs like marijuana is that the more that government tries, the higher drug prices are pushed. And in return, those traffickers who actually are not captured or don't face consequences end up becoming richer and having their power increased as a result. And so war on drugs, which has largely been, to a large degree, been targeting smaller scale dealers, has in a sense enabled the gang problems that we've had in cities, or just in general, sort of the increased power of those who escape capture. The cost of drug prohibition, what we see is that there are constantly unintended consequences, and those costs pour over into other areas of policy. So, there was a study that showed that the drug war has contributed to the funding of terrorist organizations and violent crime. In 2008, there was an estimate that up to 60% of terror organizations were connected to the illegal drug trade. And the United Nations has estimated that the international drug trade generates $320 billion a year, making it the most lucrative illicit activity. Who ends up paying those costs? Well, of course, we do. The taxpayers are the ones who, at the end of the day, at some point end up bearing the brunt of these policies. In 1980, we had 330,000 people who were jailed. In 2013, it was 1.6 million. So, and that incarceration itself comes with a massive cost, right? State and local governments are estimated to spend an additional $80 billion a year just on jailing drug offenders, which, obviously I don't need to tell everyone in California, when you're facing sort of significant budgetary difficulties, these costs are not, are pretty hard to ignore. What's the lesson, right? What should we take away from this? Well, the first and most basic lesson, and this is me, I guess, putting my economist cap on for a moment, is that it's really expensive to outlaw things. Even if you think that those things are bad, you have to realistically assess whether or not those costs are worth it, and not pretend that there aren't significant costs to undertaking that policy. Because the reality is that, again, that policy has a cost that we all end up bearing the brunt of in our own pocketbooks. And as fiscal conservatives, we should be not sort of sweeping those costs under the rug, but being candid about what we're getting in return for those policies. The other lesson, I think, more broadly, is that no policy ever exists in a vacuum, right? The drug war is no exception. It has these implications with respect to fighting terrorism or whatnot. And so, if you have a certain view on those sorts of issues, you have to consider how your support of the drug war may be undercutting the other goals that you ultimately want to accomplish. Current estimates are that California state prisons are at about 150% of capacity. And so, in recent years, there's been this sort of move toward thinking about rehabilitation instead of just incarceration. But the state still spent $12 billion on corrections and rehabilitation in its most recent budget. That's not chump change. In California, the best estimate I could find is that if you were to legalize pot and tax and regulate it like you do alcohol, it would bring in about $1.5 trillion. If you look at the Colorado example, right, you've seen Colorado legalized marijuana, usage has gone down, crime has remained the same or gone down, and of course they've seen revenue as a result. I would argue that you don't need to believe every sort of moral case that's laid out against the drug war to recognize that this policy has failed. Whether you're an all-out legalization advocate or whether you're a drug warrior who's sort of tired of losing battles, I do think there's a lot of common ground, and that common ground really comes down to the pocketbook. We can't really afford these policies that we've been undertaking for so long. Any government program, whether it's drug-related or not, has to be judged based on these costs and based on the return on that investment. As Republicans, I think you really have to step back and you have to ask, if I'm a committed fiscal conservative, how does this policy really make any sense? And now that we're seeing other states moving forward with full legalization of marijuana and seeing economic benefits as a result, I think we all, as Americans, have to really be asking, regardless of whether or not we agree with the goals or the good intentions that may exist with prohibition, are these costs really worth it? And I think anyone who thinks about that candidly knows that the answer is no. Thank you.